right, folks, welcome to the very first Fresh Faces, Frightening Fun Facts podcast of the year 2021. 2020 was a very eventful year. In fact, I don't know about you, Kit Kat, but I think it may be adequately described as a nightmare of a year.
It was definitely a nightmare. And let me say, Happy New Year, Fresh Faces, and goodbye to the unorthodox 2020. There are no accurate words like antagonistic, bewildered, sentimental, uneasiness that bombarded us last year. But we encountered resilience with a capital R and paced through the new normal. However, during the winter of 2021, hold on to your assertiveness because couch curl-ups or warm, cozy beds during the hibernating freezing season are not as therapeutic as you think. Most importantly, 9-10, never sleep again because a gruesome monster will slaughter you in your dreams. With that being said, embrace yourselves as we do the Nightmare on Elm Street countdown. And what better way to record this podcast when we were informed that the legendary Robert Englund was cast for the 4th season of Stranger Things. So more of the upside down world. I'm ready to assess these films because as the clock ticks, 5, 6, grab your crucifix.
All right, and of course that means we are hopping headlong into the entire Freddy Krueger filmography here. Before we get into the countdown itself, I know there might be a lot of younger viewers out there who didn't grow up with Freddy Krueger as the pop culture icon like we did. So, growing up in the 80s, can you kind of explain just how big A Nightmare on Elm Street was as a horror franchise?
I mean, A Nightmare on Elm Street, I would say that it was the most astonishing horror films, especially during the decade, and also Freddy Krueger is one of the most villainous, most grotesque-looking creatures, as opposed to Michael Myers, Chucky, and Jason Voorhees of Friday the 13th, because you could escape Jason Voorhees, just don't go to Camp Crystal Lake. You could escape Michael Myers, just don't get in his way in Haddonfield, Illinois. But someone who is slaughtering you in your dreams, I mean, that is unavoidable. So Freddy is by far the most scariest, freakiest, and also just like a maneuvering type of creature in the horror industry. So you audiences better watch out and don't fall asleep.
Yeah, it's really kind of hard to describe just how big, Freddy Krueger and the Elm Street franchise was back in the day. I mean, you had the movies, there was a very short-lived Freddy Krueger TV show out there for a while, you had the Freddy Krueger video games, you had toys, you had squirt balls, you had comic books. I mean, Freddy Krueger was pretty much everywhere in the 1980s, early 90s, which is kind of weird that a character who is so unbelievably, unabashedly evil would become so popular. I mean, as bad as Jason Voorhees and Michael Myers are, at least they're not, canonically child murderers and rapists. So there's that.
I hear you. And people even dress up as Freddy Krueger for Halloween, and you also see Freddy Krueger dolls at the horror cons. I mean, wow, it has really expanded. Not just back in the 1980s, but even in 2021. That is, if the conventions resume again.
Mm-hmm. Yep, and I think that is a very, very good segue. Maybe not 2020, we're going back 10 years in time to 2010 for the first film in our countdown of the Nightmare on Elm Street series. Of course, I think we both had this ranked as our least favorite in the Freddy Krueger mythos. From 2010, it is the very ill-received Nightmare on Elm Street remake. So there's a lot to go over this one, a lot to unpack, but I'll let you have the ground floor here. What did not work in this movie, and what, if anything, did work?
Well, first of all, A Nightmare on Elm Street, the remake in 2010, although this movie was released at the start of a new decade, it still doesn't outrun the original 1984 movie. Jackie Earle Haley did an outstanding job as Freddy Krueger with his jump scares and quick kills, but the physical appearance was altered with computer-generated images to make the scars look realistic, as opposed to Robert Englund's exclusive interviews stating it took 3 hours to apply the makeup and 3 hours to take it off. I mean, it is a fun horror movie, but basically it was an attempt to recapture the original, and nothing compares or is compatible to 1980s horror movies.
Yeah, there's a lot I want to get into about the movie. I think probably the big sticking point of the Elm Street remake is this. There is no way anyone should ever play Freddy Krueger other than Robert Englund. I mean, this guy, Jackie Earle Haley, I mean, he's a good actor. You know, he was really good in, I believe it was The Watchmen playing Rorschach. But he just didn't have the same gravitas. I mean, for Freddy Krueger to be Freddy Krueger, I think you have to have Robert Englund under the makeup. It just wasn't the same character, didn't have the same gravitas, didn't have the same persona. It just didn't really feel like Freddy Krueger, just more of a pale imitation.
Right. But on the positive note, Katie Cassidy, who is the daughter of Partridge Family David Cassidy, she starred in this movie. She was actually one of the main characters. That was a plus side to it because I had a crush on her father when I watched reruns of the Partridge Family. So that was one part I liked.
Well, if only it was like one of the daughters of the monkey so I could throw in a daydream believer joke.
Oh, so I take it that those are your crushes back in the 1960s and 1970s.
Hey, you know, we all had Nick at Night. We had to watch something after Looney Tunes, right?
Nick at Night, I was going to say, that's another icon moment, but we don't want to get sidetracked because, again, we are really elaborating this villainous Freddy Krueger. Oof, I'm getting the chills just talking about him. Maybe I won't sleep tonight.
Yeah, and like you said, I wasn't a big fan of the special effects on this one. One of the great things about the Elm Street movies, especially in the later ones, is they get really out there with the kills. It gets very elaborate. It goes completely into the dream world, and you have the crazy, over-the-top special effects. One of the things I did not like about the Elm Street movie, it just seemed very subdued. I don't think they really, wanted to make it as sort of grandiose as some of the earlier films. The kills were kind of rudimentary, and they tried to do some interesting things with the character about him possibly being, erroneously accused of crimes he didn't commit. But overall, it just doesn't work as a mystery. It doesn't work as a slasher movie, and I think, worst of all, it just does not work as an Elm Street movie.
Right. And more so, he was a child molester as opposed to a child murderer. So if anything, that kind of sidetracks the original plot of Nightmare on Elm Street.
Yeah, and I guess the only other really important sticking point I want to make of the movie is it was actually directed by a first-time filmmaker, a guy named Samuel Bayer, who has not made a movie since this one. And do you know what his big claim to fame is?
Unfortunately, I don't.
Right, he is a famous music video director, and probably the most famous music video he directed was 1991's "Smells Like Teen Spirit" by Nirvana. So 19 years later, he's Smells Like Dead Teenagers.
9 years, wow! And to think that I didn't even know that, but then again, I mean that goes to show you for putting this movie at the bottom of the list.
Right. Oh, and speaking of 1991, I did not plan this segue. That brings us to number 7 on our countdown of the Elm Street films, Freddy's Dead, The Final Nightmare, a movie that even now kind of gets sort of a mixed reception from the Freddy Krueger fan base. I'm kind of in the middle, so what are your general thoughts on this particular film?
With Freddy's Dead, this installment was the low to middle for me because the 1990s have begun, and this movie is nothing but a hilarious cartoon. I will point out that there is a great cast. You have Lisa Zane, who is Billy Zane's sister, Sean Greenblatt, who also starred in Newsies alongside Christian Bale and Doogie Howser's Max Casella, Breckin Meyer, who went on to portray in more comedy films like Clueless and Road Trip, and also several well-known actors that had cameos, including Johnny Depp, Roseanne Barr, Alice Cooper, etc. But again, I mean, this movie is a trip because we identify that Freddy has a daughter named Maggie, so he has this extensive family. Before saying Happy Father's Day, she kills him with the python. She also has to wear these 3D glasses to enter Freddy's mind. And, hey, Jazzy James, pass me the map. No, I'm serious. pass me the map, because back in 1991, there was no Google or MapQuest, and if you were lost, you were basically F-bomb. I'll say that much.
Yeah, there are some things I really enjoy about the movie. I think overall it just plays things way, way too comedically. I know, like you said, it's pretty much a live-action cartoon just with blood and guts. It really is a product of its time. It's like I was saying when we did the Friday the 13th overview. It seems like that franchise was so deeply embedded in the consciousness of the 1980s that taking it out of the decade doesn't really vibe. I think kind of the same thing works with Freddy Krueger. He's such a creation of the 1980s, such a phantom of the Reagan era, that when you bring him over into 1991, it just seems a little out of place. It doesn't really kind of gel with the new culture that was going on there. But I mean, we did get some good things.
You know that the ecstatic 80s are over, and on an even more hilarious note, one scene that sticks out is Spencer's brain on drugs, because by then Nintendo was really expanding. So what better yet than to have a video game slaughtering event? Jazzy James, is that your area of expertise?
Well, it wasn't as good as the actual Nightmare on Elm Street game on the NES, but it's better than the Ninja Gaiden Tiger electronic handheld game that he was playing at the beginning of the movie. That one was not a good one.
I mean, that must have been quite a workout. I mean, how many calories do you think Spencer burned to jump, run, roll over on the floor? There were some quite maneuvers with that.
That's a very good point about the Nightmare on Elm Street movies. As far as what actually happens to you when you're in a Freddy dream. Sometimes you're kind of stationary, kind of suspended in animation, and in other films like Freddy's Dead, you're literally like sleepwalking and going through chimneys and busting through walls like a Looney Tunes character. I mean, it's a very sort of inconsistent aspect of the Elm Street movies, but there's some good stuff in this one. I think the one death scene with the guy with the hearing aid is especially brutal. I think that's probably one of the goriest and grisliest deaths in the entire Elm Street series. But as a concluding film to the Elm Street franchise and finally putting the whole thing out to pasture, I just don't think it worked. It didn't have the great elements of the earlier films. It was just too cartoony. And the ending, I thought, was kind of bland.
Sure. Well, I mean, it sure, like you said, it sure provided a lot of exercise, and I should probably do that this weekend because the past few weeks have been slammed with legal cases. No, I won't be like them. I won't be like them. Be like them. All right, I'm getting a little cartoony here. Looney Tunes.
Woo. All right, and it seems like we're almost going chronologically here, backwards with the Elm Street films as we go into number 6 in our countdown. From 1989, it is A Nightmare on Elm Street, Part 5, The Dream Child, which I'm actually one of the few horror fans I've talked to who's actually kind of a pretty big fan of this one. I'm a little bit of a defender. I think you had it kind of lower to mid-tier on yours. So what are your basic thoughts on this particular entry in the Elm Street franchise?
Okay, well first, in correction, this is actually the 5th installment of the Nightmare on Elm Street series, but no problem. But this came out in 1989, and again, this was at the bottom of the list because I was very perplexed seeing Freddy Krueger on the loose, but everyone is awake. And then it takes a while to realize that it's Alice's unborn baby, Jacob Daniel, sleeping and bringing back Krueger. And then that's when Chance want to make babies, Alice. I mean, this is the kind of movie that reminded me of Halloween 6, The Curse of Michael Myers, where the film has, of course, the recurring characters, but it twists the plot of the victims and expands on the main character's family. For instance, we are introduced to Amanda Krueger, who is Freddy's nun mother. But then again, this was more of a confusing movie. It's also sentimental because this film is where Freddy taunts his victims' weaknesses and hobbies and strengths. Some examples are, Mark was a comic book fanatic, and his life ended while being a part of his favorite world. And, to make matters worse, diet-stricken supermodel Greta gets shoved food in her face to the extent where she looked like a Cabbage Patch doll. Holy moly. Don't force food on me, because 1, 2, I'll start a food fight with you.
Oh, and of course, there's also the one where I believe the guy's name is Jake, the character. He gets basically turned into like some sort of like fusion skeleton motorcycle hybrid. Very, very unusual scene for an Elm Street movie. That almost seems kind of like almost like a Japanese manga-esque sort of death, which is really not kind of what you think of for a 1989 film. But,
Yes, and that was, in some ways, it was bittersweet because this film was released in 1989 and the 80s were coming to an end, and here you have this turning Japanese situation, and that song came out in 1980, so we're kind of flip-flopping here.
Ah, yes. And for me, kind of going back to what you said, it's a very confusing movie. It seems like the kind of film where it starts off with one idea but doesn't really know how to complete it all the way with introducing Amanda Krueger and kind of going back into Freddy's backstory. One thing about the Elm Street movies is, and I've always kind of disliked this, not a lot of things I dislike about the movies, but this is one of them, is they're always changing the one way to kill Freddy. And in this movie, I don't even really know how to explain how they kill Freddy. It's just basically like all of his victims come out of him and rip him apart. It's just a really hard and abstract way to kind of kill off the character. And some of the subplots really didn't go anywhere, but at least, Alice, I think, is a pretty underrated final girl. I think Lisa Wilcox is one of the better scream queens, understated for sure, from the era. And it's kind of sad they didn't kind of continue on. I think she would have been a really great face for the rest of the franchise, and seeing her story continue on instead of Freddy's death, I think probably been a better movie series overall.
I concur. I really liked Lisa Wilcox's character in the Nightmare on Elm Street movies, and yes, like Heather Langenkamp, I wish they had expanded Alice just as much as Nancy, because she was really becoming part of the Nightmare on Elm Street franchises.
All right, and moving along, it is number 5 on our countdown. This is one movie that is near and dear to both of our hearts. I've already talked about a little bit in depth in our earlier countdown. From 1985, it is Freddy's Revenge, the hilariously campy cult classic Elm Street, as it's sometimes called. Really, what more can you say about this movie? It's a movie that when it came out originally, people really didn't kind of pick up on the subtext of it. And now that's pretty much everything everyone talks about when they talk about the movie. They overlook the horror dynamics. It's all about it being an analogy for coming out of the closet. So it kind of depends on how you want to look at the movie, how you interpret it. As a standalone slasher film, or as something with a little bit more fabulous underpinnings to it.
And Jazzy James, this movie, and again, I'll try not to reiterate what we said when we critiqued Nightmare on Elm Street 2 back during academic horrors, but this movie was in the middle of my list because I know people like to call it the gay movie because Freddy is inside of him. Like his famous quote in this movie is, "You've got the body, I've got the brain." But I think this is a very unique movie because Jesse Walsh is the new kid on the block, and he's got to be hanging tough because little does he know the horror history of 1428 Elm Street, which is the old home of Nancy Thompson. And he is considered the protagonist and the antagonist. And it kind of gives Freddy Krueger a break. And Mr. Walsh, no offense, but please join the circus because don't wake up from a horrible dream with a ferocious snake on your shoulders. I mean, that's just ew, ew, ew. Also, to point out, Nightmare on Elm Street 2 celebrated its 35th anniversary on November 1st of 2020. So it's hard to believe that this film was in theaters November 1st of 1985. So, again, congratulations on that anniversary. And just seeing Mark Patton, Robert Rusler, Kim Myers, and even Robert Englund just all connect together. They go to the cons together. And also, I had the opportunity to meet Mark Patton at Days of the Dead Atlanta back in 2012. I thought he was very nice and approachable toward his fans. He did not mind analyzing a movie that affected his life from many years ago, which brings up his, I believe it's called Scream Queen, My Nightmare on Elm Street, which makes sense as to why he chose to do the movie. But it's good. And then, of course, he gets to do revenge on his adamant gym teacher.
Yeah, I racked my brain earlier trying to think of something you said movie that I didn't already bring up during academic horrors. And I think the one that I didn't discuss is how great the father figure in the movie is. Clu Gallagher, playing Jesse's dad in this movie. He's such a... he doesn't really seem like a character from an 80s movie. He seems more like a 1950s dad sort of superimposed in a slasher film. And he has a lot of great lines in this one. You know, I think my favorite is the part where he starts noticing his son is going through some very bizarre changes, and his first instinct is to send him to a methadone clinic.
That, and also, I loved the look on his face when Jesse came home in the pouring rain with just a towel wrapped around him. I mean, can you imagine, like, you open the door, you see your naked child and the police standing around. I mean, if anything, that's like a horror dream in reality.
Oh, and that is the perfect segue for the next film in our countdown. From 1994, Wes Craven's New Nightmare, a movie that actually brings Freddy Krueger into the real world, kinda. So, yeah, the basic backstory behind this one is, of course, Wes Craven was responsible for the first Freddy Krueger film. Long story short, New Line Cinema kind of took the rights away from him, so he kind of stayed out of most movies except for Part 3. So then, 1984, 10 years after the first Elm Street movie comes out, he's finally back on board, and he's directing a Freddy Krueger movie again. And this time around, he's actually kind of taking it out of the canonical Elm Street series and bringing his most iconic character into the real world of Hollywood, where he begins, of course, what else? Stalking Heather Lampenkagan in real life. So
yes, and I like how this movie was directed by Wes Craven because, again, he transitioned the iconic roles into a combination. As you know, reality and fantasy, they combine, but in an unsettling way. This movie was on the middle of my list because I like how it brought back Heather Langenkamp / Nancy Thompson, John Saxon / Donald Thompson, Robert Englund / Freddy Krueger, and the Freddy Krueger character is re-identified between the fictional and non-fictional characters, where all of the actors were portraying themselves. I really like how Heather, not Nancy, I think I got this right, but I liked how Heather's son was portrayed by Nico Hughes, whom we all know as the creepy Gage Creed in Pet Sematary. He also had a role in Kindergarten Cop and a recurring role in Full House. And he is more of Freddy's target. Oh, also on a side note, if you ever met Nico Hughes at the conventions, make sure to ask him about New Nightmare and not Pet Sematary, because he has more memories of this film.
Yeah, I can only imagine if you're a child actor and you grew up and your resume from like age 5 is a Freddy Krueger movie and Pet Sematary, what sort of psychological damage that would do to you, but he seems to be a pretty stand-up guy. For
sure. And again, I like how Heather is making this movie about Nancy and Freddy. And again, I mean, it's just, it twists the iconic roles around, just to kind of paraphrase what you said, but I like this one.
Yeah, there's a lot of really great things about this movie. I think it kind of holds up a lot better than I initially thought when I rewatched it recently. A couple of things about the film is it's a movie that Wes Craven, you know, he was actually like an English teacher, wasn't he, or a philosophy teacher before he became a filmmaker? And
from what I remember, yes.
So he's the kind of guy, he likes to layer in a lot of, you know, subtext, a lot of allusions to classical literature in his works. So this one, it's actually, when you get down to the meat of it, it's actually a really, really violent and intense remake of Hansel and Gretel. That's more or less the basic plot line here, even at the end of the movie, when they actually have Freddy Krueger luring Heather and her child into, I guess, the Freddy hell, for lack of a better term. And also a couple of other references here, a lot of references to Dutch art, I believe Hieronymus Bosch. That's actually kind of the framework they use for the model of hell towards the end of the film. And of course, obviously, like you were saying earlier, much of the film revolves around Heather's child in the movie. So it's kind of a subtextual film, not unlike Freddy's Revenge, where maybe it's not just about Freddy, but just about your feelings of being an inadequate parent. So I think that adds another level of intrigue to it that a lot of horror films from that time frame didn't have. And I think everything works. It's a very effective movie. It makes Freddy Krueger scary again. You know, after being kind of a cartoon character for years and years, it's good to see Wes Craven come back and actually make him, you know, an intimidating, menacing figure again. I'm a fan of this one.
I did. And also, this time it brings out Wes Craven's, not role, but I was going to say his adaptation of Freddy Krueger, because I didn't know if you knew, Wes Craven got the fictional Freddy Krueger from being bullied when he was a kid. And I remember during his tormenting days, that's when he got a little creative, you know, did a little bit of imagination, and that's why he written and directed and came up with the name Freddy Krueger. Of course, I mean, he added the story saying child murderer, taunter, dream stalker, etc., but the new Nightmare movie, you know, really brings out Wes Craven's reason for defining Freddy Krueger and how it impacted his life, you know, from bullies when he was a child.
And of course, that brings things full circle to the third film in our countdown. Of course, the original 1984 Nightmare on Elm Street. So this one came out, I want to say, about 2 years before I was born. So do you actually have memories of the film being released, or just what its initial impact on culture was?
So this is like A Nightmare on Elm Street, like the first one, like the first installment, right?
It is.
Released in 1984. Unfortunately not, because I was 4 years old, and back then I was petrified of horror movies. I remember when we did our Friday the 13th countdown, those were still the days when I was too apprehensive to walk into video stores. I had to sidestep past the horror section. I just could not do it. But I laugh about it now. But going back to Nightmare on Elm Street, directed and written by Wes Craven, that's when we are introduced to Freddy Krueger. Like, who is this man in a dirty red sweater, hat, and knives for fingers, preying on teenagers, having the same nightmares? And as we know, Tina Gray, portrayed by Amanda Wyss, is one of the first victims. And when she first awakes, she is foreboding all day because her gut feeling is telling her that this maniac is going to be back. But of course, her friends dismiss her concerns. And as we know, Amanda Wyss is notably known for her role in Nightmare on Elm Street because her slaughter moments was one of the bloodiest deaths in horror history. And when I had the opportunity to interview Amanda Wyss for Uncommon Journalism, her direct quote, because she probably gets asked this like extensively, numerous times, but her direct quote was, "I learned how to survive a rotating room."
And that's something they should really train more classical actors to be prepared for, is acting in a moving room.
Right. So therefore, and I hate to spoil this, audiences, but she did not feel trepidatious, and it turns out that the whole sequence came out really well. They rehearsed a lot. There were no improvisations, thankfully no injuries. They shot it in bits and pieces, choreographed it, and once the blood was introduced, there was no going back. So if anything, it was a very memorable and astonishing scene for her. And again, I know that this went down in horror history, kind of like Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer.
Yes, Rudolph, the red-nosed, child-murdering, fedora-wearing dream murderer.
Yeah, I was going to say, no red nose this time. If anything, it was a white nightgown that turned red.
And of course, probably the biggest actor in the entire film is, of course, Johnny Depp, making his, I'm not sure if it was his first major film performance. That's what's kind of popularly described as. So he plays the romantic male lead in the film, and his death is, well, it pretty much speaks for itself. Not a very realistic demise, but certainly one of the most historic and famous and noteworthy in horror history. The guy falls asleep watching MTV, and, well, his bed eats him.
His bed eats him, yeah. And it's not that his bed just eats them, like the blood just comes spurting out, like just popping up, streams of it, like to let the audience know, hey, his bed ate him.
Yeah, I think there's only like, what, 8, 9 gallons of blood in the human body at any time, and there was at least 2,000 in that one, so I don't know.
Maybe even 3,000.
Yeah, I don't know where he's hiding the water weight on that one.
Yeah, but once Glenn was murdered, I mean, it was up to Nancy to stop Freddy Krueger, and she was able to identify that he feeds on his victims' fears. So when she said, "You're nothing," turns around, that's when he disappears, but not for good.
And of course, one of the hallmarks of the Elm Street movies is because it is so rooted in the dream world, at any given time in an Elm Street movie, you really don't have an idea if it's actually happening in real life, diegetically, or if it's supposed to be happening in the nightmare world. So this entire movie, you really don't know if it's a dream, or if it's reality, or if it's a dream that's in reality, or reality that's in a dream, or reality inside a dream. So it goes on and on like that, until you get to the big grand finale where it looks like everything is back to normal, and then all of a sudden, the Freddy Krueger car shows up and paves the way for 7 sequels.
Yes, and I really liked the Freddy Krueger type of car because you know that he is not gone for good. Like, his stalking and dreams have not ceased.
Yep, and do you have like any particular like favorite moment? I mean, what would you say is the big takeaway from the entire movie here? Like, what would be the most iconic scene from the original Elm Street movie?
There are so many iconic scenes in this movie, but I really like when Nancy Thompson supposedly burned herself in English class because at first she sees Tina all covered in blood, all zipped up, and then she encounters the hall monitor. I love it when the pigtailed woman says no running in the halls, and then you can tell it's getting to be a really intense and gruesome moment. Then, when she is supposed to be studying in English class, she's in this boiler room, just very naive, just not knowing what's going on, not knowing who this person is, not knowing what's going to happen next. But also at the same time is she's beginning to realize, like, hey, I'm in this gruesome dream. I need to wake up. That's why as he's charging toward her, that's when she screamed out, "It's only a dream. It's only a dream." So if anything, she knew what she was doing by burning herself in English class because, again, as the main protagonist, she had to stop them.
And for me, I think it's a very, very simple scene, but an incredibly effective one. That's when they actually show Freddy Krueger for the first time, and he's coming down the alleyway, and he has like 10-foot long Stretch Armstrong arms.
And this was the first time he was after Tina, correct?
It is.
It is. So if anything, that's when she first sees him, but at the same time, he let her go. This was but then the next time she fell asleep, she was gone.
Yeah, and the thing is, I've seen so many filmmakers try to do what Wes Craven did with Freddy Krueger. There have been so many Freddy Krueger ripoffs throughout horror history. Some more effective than others. I mean, Chucky's a good one. Leprechaun has a little bit of moderate success. But there have been so many movies where they've tried to make a charismatic serial killer, and they've just been terrible. I mean, there's movies like Sleep Stalker. There's a movie called, there are literally dozens and dozens of terrible Freddy Krueger wannabe characters out there. But I think the thing that makes the character effective, once again, is Robert Englund. He brings such a seriousness to the role, such a casualness. I mean, he's a classically trained Shakespearean actor, but he also just has sort of a commonality to him. He's very believable. He seems like I hate to say this, but he's not the guy that could actually be a serial killer in real life. I mean, he has that quality to him. He's kind of quiet, reserved, and it just is so effective. Even just him not saying anything, when he shows up on screen, not saying a word, he has so much gravitas. He brings so much, force and energy to the role that I just can't imagine anyone else really replicating the character and making him successful the way Robert Englund did. So if it wasn't for him, I don't think he'd become the world famous character he was. We wouldn't actually have the Elm Street mythos. So that's how important Rob is.
And when I met him at DragonCon 2019, he was very professional. I mean, for someone who portrayed a slicey, dicey character, again, he was very nice, very approachable, very compassionate. I really liked him. It was good to get an autograph of him. And also, additionally, I don't know if you remember the TV show Just the 10 of Us. It only lasted for 1 or 2 seasons in the late 1980s, early 1990s, but there is a strong connection with the Nightmare on Elm Street characters. Heather Langenkamp, Brooke Thies from Nightmare on Elm Street 4, and Joanne Willett from Nightmare on Elm Street 2 were all on that show.
Wow, that's a pretty robust connection there. Think they'll have the same agent?
And also, Heather Langenkamp's character was a nun in Just the 10 of Us. So how about that? She went from being the heroic Nancy Thompson to a nun.
Don't you just love it when things go full circle like that?
Full circle?
Yes.
Full swing.
All right, now we're down to the top 2, and I think when you talk to most Freddy Krueger fans, these are the 2 movies that are neck and neck for the best. So once I give away this one, we'll know what number 1 is. I think they're very equal in footing in me. I think it's a matter of preference. So you had number 1 on your list, A Nightmare on Elm Street, Part 4, The Dream Master from 1988. So since this is your favorite of the Elm Street movies, I'll just let you just have free will here. Just go into what you love about it and what you thinks it's the ultimate Freddy Krueger experience.
It's the most treasured Nightmare on Elm Street installment. I mean, this was 1988, where you were living in the Wild, Wild West. One of my favorite songs from the Escape Club. Love the cast, love the effects, love the soundtrack and the settings. And Alice is welcomed into Wonderland with dream powers. She goes from an introverted, reserved, timid girl to a defeated, strong-hearted hero. And it's an interesting way to transform your style and behaviors by fending off Freddy Krueger and no narcissism necessary. And Dan was so hot, and she won that honk. Also, about Nightmare on Elm Street 4 is I really loved the movie poster. When I first stared at it when I was 8 years old, the eyes in the rainbow stared right back at me. It felt so freakishly dreamy that I almost saw the movie back then, but still did not have the courage. But no worries. I also like the song, Running from This Nightmare, which was sung by Tuesday Knight, who was Kristen Parker in this movie. And, of course, back when MTV was worthwhile, I mean, listening to Billy Idol on a waterbed, I haven't slept on those in decades, years, ages. Damn, we're getting old.
You know, we got to talk about the soundtrack of this movie, because I could do like an entire podcast on just how great this thing is. I think from front end to front end, this is one of the best overall horror soundtracks in genre history. You already have the 2 songs you mentioned. You've got the one song by Divinals, Back Against the Wall, fantastic song. You have the Fat Boys doing the famous Freddy Krueger rap. But my favorite song on this one, and this is unironically one of my favorite songs ever, Anything by Dramarama.
I mean, I loved the soundtrack, and there are so many memorable scenes. I mean, soul food, ugh, thank God. I'm not addicted to pepperoni and sausage pizza. Ugh, I don't plan on eating souls. Also, being pulled into the movie, and when you look back, there's just this nonchalant applause. Another good one was On the Beach, where Kristen Parker does dream someplace nice. At first this works, but then Freddy's glove emerges from the ocean, and then she goes from quicksand to the boiler room. And, of course, when Alice pulls Sheila into her dream, I'll have to say that learning was not fun with Freddy because science was not one of my weakest subjects in school. Like, I could study physics all night and still fail. So, needless to say, the how sweet, fresh meat, I think I'll stay awake.
So, yeah, I've got like three or four things like on top of my head right now, floating back and forth here. Let's start off with Tuesday Night, coming in replacing Patricia Arquette as the main character. And they kind of did a bait and switch on us in this one because we kind of thought that she continued to be the heroine. She kind of replaced Nancy moving forward with the franchise, but halfway through it, she gets killed.
I know. And also, it wasn't a very nice kill. I mean, she was burned.
Oh, the horrible irony. So, this is one of those movies where, looking back on it, I mean, I know it's a very popular fan favorite film, but you know, they killed off Joey, they killed off Kristen, they killed off my favorite character in the entire Elm Street franchise, Kincaid. I mean, don't you kind of wish they would have continued on with these characters and had them kind of be a staple throughout the rest of the movies?
Oh, most definitely. And as far as Debbie's death, I mean, oh, how can you become a bug right before you are slaughtered? But I will have to say, Debbie should not have squished the bugs. I mean, hey, everybody has their fears, but bugs are not as terrifying as they may look.
Yeah, there are a lot of really great death scenes in this one. Obviously, you got Debbie being squished to death in a Roach Motel. You've got Joey drowning in a waterbed. Very, very nice touch there. Kincaid gets stabbed to death. Pretty rudimentary there. The one that I hated, though, was the death of the guy where he's basically fighting an invisible Freddy. I mean, come on. You got a big budget. You got this great character, all this fantastical stuff. That's the best you can come up with?
Oh, for sure. And also, one creepy moment was when Kincaid's dog, Jason.
Oh, I wonder what they're alluding to there.
Yes, when he peed out fire. I mean, oh my gosh. If my cat Tommy did that, I mean, I would not know what to do. I mean, first I would think that I was hallucinating, but then when I snapped back to reality, I would be like, oh my gosh, did my cat just pee out fire? And that's when I knew. And once I saw that scene, I'm like, okay, this is going to be my most favorite Nightmare on Elm Street movie.
And of course, you know, there's a lot of other really interesting things about the movie. I'm trying to see what else really kind of stands out to me about this particular movie. The director is a guy named Rennie Harlan, who later went on to do Die Hard 2. He's done a lot of movies, so it's like one of his first major break. And when you look at the Elm Street movies, it's actually kind of like a breeding ground for a lot of really great, promising directors. I mean, Wes Craven obviously was up and coming. You had Chuck Russell for Part 3. You had Stephen Hopper, who went on to do Predator 2 and a couple other movies later on in the 90s. So behind the Elm Street movies, you've always had really talented directors with vision. So if absolutely nothing else, you get a lot of really cool aesthetics in the movies. And I think on a moment-by-moment basis, this is probably the coolest looking of the Elm Street movies, no denying it.
And that's why the tagline is terror beyond your wildest dreams.
All right. Anything else you want to say about Elm Street 4 before we head into our number one ranking movie?
You know, I think that concludes it. I mean, it's one of those situations where I could elaborate more, but you may fall asleep if I did that. So I think we should move on to your favorite, which is Nightmare on Elm Street 3, The Dream Warriors from 1987. And this was directed by Chuck Russell. Now, since this is your favorite movie, Jazzy James, maybe tonight you'll be gone. Don't want to dream no more? We are the Dream Warriors. God, I love that music video.
Oh, yes. Who can forget Dokken, the great 80s hair metal band? And that's a really great song. Like, unironically, I love that one. I listen to it every Halloween.
And it's not every day that you rescue a little girl, and when you look down, she's a skeleton.
You know, one of the things I've noticed, you know, speaking with, you know, Elm Street fans, is there's kind of a group, a little subset that I fall into where not only do I believe Elm Street 3 is objectively the best of the Elm Street movies, as far as I'm concerned, this is the only Elm Street movie. I think this is the one where it gets the formula right, where you have Freddy Krueger being just the right proportion of sinister and evil and spooky, and also just the right proportion of, you know, really comedic and jovial and entertaining. And the cast is incredible. I mean, you've got so many great A-listers in here. The special effects are top-notch. It's got the best deaths in the entire series, the best script, the best storyline, the best characters. I mean, I could go on and on about how great this movie is.
Right. And also, it's one of those roller coaster movies because it's got various kills and different types of issues with the mental patients at the hospital. My top two favorite ones are, of course, Welcome to Primetime, Bitch, and then Jennifer gets her head smashed into the TV. And, of course, the puppet, because you have this Pinocchio moment here, but with a twist, because in the fantasy, you are hosted by strings, but in reality, you are a real boy literally hanging off a cliff, and then you're gone. So what were your two favorite moments with the patients and their, I was going to say, and their sidetracks, or sidekicks, I should say?
Well, you know, as the unofficial president of the Kincaid fan club of the United States of America, any time he's on screen would be my favorite moment of the entire movie. But yeah, I think probably the one that affected me the most was the one you talked about, the part with the puppet. This is the first Elm Street movie I saw, and I saw it when I was like 5 or 6. They were showing it on cable. And this was a scene that was so utterly disturbing to me that I'm not ashamed to admit it. My first experience with the Freddy Krueger movie, 5 minutes in, I threw up. So we're off to a good start with my fandom on this one. It's just such a yeah.
Well, when you said that you threw up, I mean, in that case, where is the effing bourbon? Andale.
Oh, man, there's just so many great things with this movie. Other than that, I mean, I guess probably my other favorite death or near death would probably be the part where Joey ends up being seduced by the nurse, who actually isn't a nurse at all. It's actually Freddy Krueger, and he ends up making out with a demonic child rapist, which is not something you want to do on really any day of the week.
No, and how he was just deceived because all he wanted to do was get some action. And I had the pleasure of meeting the Nightmare on Elm Street 3 cast, well, the majority of them, at Days of the Dead Charlotte in 2018. There were Ken Sagos, who was Kincaid, Penelope Sudrow, who was Jennifer, Heather Langenkamp, Jennifer Rubin, Bradley Gregg, and many more. Great group of people. You should have seen how that they did their creative ways with pausing for pictures. And I was able to talk to Ken. Again, great guy, and he really reminisced his youth days residing in Atlanta. He currently lives in Los Angeles, but hopefully he will attend the local conventions because who knows, we might snag an interview for Uncommon Journalism.
Out of all of the genre actors, he's going to be like number 2 or number 3 on my countdown. He's way, way up there. And I know I alluded to this in some of the emails we sent back and forth. And get ready, folks, we're going off on a tangent. One of my most favorite ironic twists in the universe anytime ever is that me and Ken, we actually went to the same college. He attended Kennesaw State University outside of Metro Atlanta, as did I. And there was actually a point in my senior year where I actually tried to get a petition circulated to rename the campus from Kennesaw State University to Ken Sagos University. So you still have the same initials. I think we got about 12 or 13 signatures, so it's still out there somewhere on the internet if anyone wants to add to it. I think it'd be a nice little addition. I think if anyone deserves to have an institution of higher learning named after them, it would be Kincaid.
You know, that would have been such a great invention. Too bad that didn't become a major turnout. And I'm sure that Ken would get a kick out of it as well.
Yeah. And he's one of those guys where he shows up in some of like the most random movies and TV shows. Like I was watching It's Always Sunny a couple of weeks ago, and he just has like a sudden cameo out of the blue nowhere, somewhere. Like this, he shows up as a waiter, and you're like, wait, that's Kincaid from Elm Street. You know, what's he doing here? So it's always good to see him, and he has the same voice, the same attitude, the same inflection, just the same, energetic, captivating persona. So Ken, you got an internal fan right here, buddy.
Absolutely. And I like how Heather Langenkamp reprises her role as Nancy Thompson, and she visits the hospital. She's the intern there, and how Kristen Parker really becomes close to her. And that whole thing about being able to be pulled into dreams. I consider myself pretty adventurous, but I may or may not give that a go.
Yeah, I mean, people have some bizarre, things they do in real life. I can only imagine what they do actually in their dream world with no consequences. For me, Elm Street 3, I mean, there's so many things. This is such a loaded movie. There's so many things we haven't even discussed. The guy who turns into like a Dungeons and Dragons wizard, he's a really popular fan favorite character. Jennifer Rubin, we haven't talked about her playing Tara, another, all-time classic, Scream Queen character, who has one of the really grossest deaths in the entire Elm Street series. What have we left out? I mean, there's just a lot of great stuff going on in this movie, and I haven't seen it in a really long time. I really have an itch to watch this one now.
Yeah, I mean, it's bizarre because, and at first, she's able to defeat Freddy. It's going really well. I mean, she's in this punk gothic type of 80s outfit. Again, she's able to, well, kick the crap out of him. I'll be candid about that. But then all of a sudden, he finds the weakness in her, which is that she's a drug addict. And just seeing like these eyes grow in her arms,
Oof.
I'm trying to think of a real strong word to say that. Like, I mean, honestly, like, how would you react if you had eyes opening on your arms and legs?
Yeah, people very rarely describe the Elm Street movies as a body horror sort of subgenre. But looking back on it, I mean, with what's going on in Elm Street 3, with the shoot up marks coming alive, and then people turning to cockroaches in Part 4, and the body dysmorphia stuff going on in Part 5. I mean, that's kind of Freddy's milieu a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, throughout, not just Nightmare on Elm Street 3, but the whole Nightmare on Elm Street franchises. I mean, again, there's just a lot of morphing and exercising and maneuvering. I mean, you really get a decent workout with Freddy Krueger's kills.
Absolutely. I can't think of a better way to go out on than that. So yeah, those are our countdown of the Elm Street mythos. The thing about Freddy Krueger, I mean, there are so many things we didn't talk about surrounding the character. There were so many plots that were never filmed. I mean, at one point in time, I believe Peter Jackson of Lord of the Rings fame was actually working on a Freddy Krueger film around in between Elm Street 5 and Elm Street 6. I mean, there's just so much Freddy stuff out there, and I don't know, what do you think about the future of the Elm Street series? Do you want to see Freddy come back for one more go at it?
I think so. I mean, and again, I think it would really expand the popularity of the Nightmare on Elm Street series. But getting back to the beginning of the podcast, I was thrilled to find out that Robert Englund was cast for the 4th season of Stranger Things, because not only is it considered the upside down world of the prominent TV show, but it also takes place in the 1980s.
Oh, there's got to be some sort of inside joke in there somewhere. They got to throw in at least one or two references.
I'm sure, and if it hadn't been for the stupid plague, I just cannot wait to see the release of Stranger Things season 4. I mean, obviously they had to postpone their productions, but I really am looking forward to it. I'm just, the anticipation is killing me.
I almost forgot. My favorite piece of alternative Nightmare on Elm Street media, the Freddy Krueger pinball game from 1994. It's great. If you haven't seen it, Google it.
I might do that.
All right. Well, that is pretty much everything I've got on Mr. Krueger here. Glad to see that, Robert Englund is still out there, working his magic. And these movies hold up a lot better than I thought they would, Admittedly, some of the earlier Halloween movies, some of the earlier Friday the 13th, they do seem a little bit dated, a little outmoded. But the Elm Street movies, to me, I think have a little bit more of a timeless quality to them. They kind of touch upon a lot of social issues that really don't go away in society. And there's that little bit of undercurrent of, cultural commentary going on that you don't see in some of the other slasher franchises. So there's a lot more to digest here with the Freddy movies. And, hopefully we'll get lucky. Maybe we'll see Robert Englund put on the fedora and sweater one more time and finally bring the franchise to a kill here. But what else can I say?
I was going to say, let's continue to ponder about that and hope that will happen. So, to conclude the evening, sing with me. Ready? 1, 2, Freddy's coming for you. 3, 4, better lock your door. 5, 6, Grab your crucifix. 7, 8, gonna stay up late. No! 9, 10, never sleep again. Fresh faces. Happy winter. Happy Valentine's Day. Happy night. Don't fall asleep.
That's all we got, folks. Sleep tight.